Bibliographical Notice for the Logic of Hegel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Smallwood. The Logic of Hegel by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Translated by William Wallace. Bibliographical Notice on the 3 editions and prefaces of the Encyclopedia. The Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in outline is the third in time of the 4 works which Hegel published. It was preceded by the Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807 and the Science of Logic in 2 volumes in 1812 and 1816, and was followed by the Outlines of the Philosophy of Law in 1820. The only other works which came directly from his hand are a few essays, addresses, and reviews. The earliest of these appeared in the Critical Journal of Philosophy, issued by his friend Schelling and himself in 1802, when Hegel was 31, which, as Bacon thought, is a great deal of sand in the hourglass, and the latest were his contributions to the Jahrbucher für wissenschaftliche Kritik in the year of his death, 1831. This encyclopedia is the only complete, matured, and authentic statement of Hegel's philosophical system. But, as the title page bears, it is only an outline, and its preliminary aim is to supply a manual for guidance of his students. In its mode of exposition, the free flight of speculation is subordinated to the needs of the professorial classroom. Pegasus is put in harness. Paragraphs, concise in form and saturated with meaning, postulate and presuppose the presiding spirit of the lecturer, to fuse them into continuity and raise them to higher lucidity. Yet in 2 directions the works of Hegel furnish a supplement to the defects of the encyclopedia. One of these aids to comprehension is the Phenomenology of Spirit, published in his 37th year. It may be going too far to say with David Strauss that it is the alpha and omega of Hegel, and his later writings only extracts from it. Here the Pegasus of mind soars free through the untrodden fields of air, and tastes the joys of first love and pride of fresh discovery in the quest for truth. The fire of young enthusiasm has not yet been forced to hide itself and smoulder away in apparent calm. The mood is Olympian, far above the turmoil and bitterness of lower earth, free from the bursts of temper which emerge later, when the thinker has to mingle in the fray and endure the shafts of controversy. But the phenomenology, if not less than the encyclopedia it contains the diamond purity of Hegelianism, is a key which needs consummate patience and skill to use with advantage. If it commands a larger view, it demands a stronger wing of him who would join its voyage through the atmosphere of thought up to its purest empyrean. It may be the royal road to the idea, but only the kingly soul can retrace its course. The other commentary on the encyclopedia is supplied partly by Hegel's other published writings, and partly by the volumes 9 through 15 in the collected works, in which his editors have given his lectures on the philosophy of history, on aesthetic, on the philosophy of religion, and on the history of philosophy. All these lectures, as well as the philosophy of law published by himself, deal, however, only with the third part of his philosophical system. That system includes 1. Logic, 2. Philosophy of nature, and 3. Philosophy of spirit. It is this third part, or rather, it is the last 2 divisions therein, embracing the great general interests of humanity such as law and morals, religion and art, as well as the development of philosophy itself, which form the topics of Hegel's most expanded teaching. It is in this region that he has most appealed to the liberal culture of the century, and influenced, directly or by reaction, the progress of the philosophical history and the historical philosophy of which our own generation is reaping the fast accumulating fruit. If one may force such a category into the systematic philosophy, we may say the study of objective and absolute spirit is the most interesting part of Hegel. Of the second part of the system there is less to be said. For nearly half a century the study of nature has passed almost completely out of the hands of philosophers into the care of specialists of science. There are signs indeed everywhere, and among others Helmholtz has lately reminded us, that the higher order of scientific students are ever and anon driven by the very logic of their subject into the precincts or borders of philosophy. But the name of philosophy of nature still recalls the time of hasty enthusiasms and over-grasping ambition of thought, which, in its eagerness to understand the mystery of the universe, jumped to conclusions on insufficient grounds, trusted to bold but fantastic analogies, and lavished an unwise contempt on the plodding industry of mere hodmen of facts and experiments. Calmer retrospection will perhaps modify this verdict and sift the various contributions toward a philosophical unity of the sciences, which are now indiscriminately damned by the title of Naturphilosophie. But for the present purpose, it need only be said, for the second part of Hegelian system, we are restricted for explanations to the notes collected by the editors of Volume 7, Part 1 of the collected works, notes derived from annotations which Hegel himself supplied, and 8 or more courses of lectures which he gave on the philosophy of nature between 1804 and 1830. Quite other is the case with the Logic, the first division of the Encyclopedia. There we have the collateral authority of the science of logic, the larger logic which appeared whilst Hegel was schoolmaster at Nuremberg. The idea of a new logic formed the natural sequel to the publication of the Phenomenology in 1807. In that year Hegel was glad to accept, as a stopgap and potboiler, the post of editor at the Bamberg journal. But his interests lay in other directions, and circumstances of the time and the country helped to determine their special form. In Bavaria, he says in a letter, it looks as if organization were the current business. A very mania of reform, says another, prevailed. Hegel's friend and fellow Swabian Niethammer held an important position at the Bavarian Education Office, and wished to employ the philosopher in the work of carrying out his plans of reorganizing the higher education of the Protestant subjects of the crown. He asked if Hegel would write a logic for school use, and if he cared to become a rector of the grammar school. Hegel, who was already at work on his larger logic, was only half attracted to the suggestion. Quote, the traditional logic, he replied, is a subject on which there are textbooks enough, but at the same time it is one which can by no means remain as it is. It is a thing nobody can make anything of. 'Tis dragged along like an old heirloom only because a substitute of which the want is universally felt is not yet in existence. The whole of its rule, still current, might be written on 2 pages. Every additional detail beyond these 2 is perfectly fruitless scholastic subtlety, or if this logic is to get a thicker body, its expansion must come from psychological paltrinesses. End quote. Still less did he like the prospects of instructing in theology as then rationalized. Quote, to write a logic and to be a theological instructor is as bad as to be a whitewasher and chimney sweep at once. Shall he who for many long years built his eyrie on the wild rock beside the eagle and learned to breathe the free air of the mountains, now learn to feed on the carcasses of dead thoughts and stillborn thoughts of the moderns, and vegetate in the leaden air of mere babble? End quote. At Nuremberg he found the post of rector of the gymnasium by no means a sinecure. The school had to be made amid a lack of funds and general bankruptcy of apparatus, all because of an, quote, all-powerful, unalterable destiny which it called the course of business, end quote. One of his tasks was, quote, by graduated exercises to introduce his pupils to the speculative thought, end quote, and that in the space of 4 hours weekly. Of its practicability, and especially with himself as instrument, he had grave doubts. In theory, he held that an intelligent study of the ancient classics was the best introduction to philosophy, and practically, he preferred starting his pupils with the principles of law, morality, and religion, and reserving the logic and higher philosophy for the highest class. Meanwhile, he continued to work on his great logic, the first volume of which appeared in 2 parts in 1812 and 1813, and the second in 1816. This is the work which is the real foundation of Hegelian philosophy. Its aim is the systematic reorganization of the commonwealth of thought. It gives not a criticism like Kant, not a principle like Fichte, not a bird's eye view of the fields of nature and history like Schelling. It attempts the hard work of reconstructing, step by step, in totality, the fragments of the organism of intelligence. It is scholasticism, if scholasticism means absolute and all-embracing system, but it is a protest against the old school system, those who tried to rehabilitate it through their comprehension of Kantian theory. Apropos of the logic of his contemporary Fries, whom he did not love, published in 1811, he remarks, quote, his paragraphs are mindless, quite shallow, bald, trivial. The explanatory notes are the dirty linen of the professorial chair, utterly slack and unconnected. End quote. Of himself, he thus speaks, quote, I am a schoolmaster who has to teach philosophy, who, possibly for that reason, believes that philosophy, like geometry, is teachable, and must no less than geometry have a regular structure. But again, a knowledge of the facts in geometry and philosophy is one thing, and the mathematical or philosophical talent which procreates and discovers is another. My province is to discover that scientific form, or to aid the formation of it. End quote. So he writes to an old college friend, and in a letter to the rationalist theologian Paulus in 1814 he professes, quote, you know that I have had too much to do, not merely with ancient literature, but even with mathematics, laterally with the higher analysis, differential calculus, chemistry, to let myself be taken in with the humbug of naturphilosophy, philosophizing without knowledge of fact, by mere force of imagination, and treating mere fancies, even imbecile fancies, as ideas. End quote. In the autumn of 1816, Hegel became professor of philosophy at Heidelberg. In the following year appeared the first edition of his encyclopedia. 2 others appeared in his lifetime in 1827 and 1830. The first edition is a thin octavo volume of 288 pages, published like the others at Heidelberg. The logic in it occupies pages 1 through 126, of which 12 pages are the Einleitung, and 18 pages the Vorbegriff. In the Philosophy of Nature, pages 127 through 204, and the Philosophy of Mind, or Spirit, pages 205 to 288. In the preface, the book is described as setting forth, quote, a new treatment of philosophy on a method which will, as I hope, yet be recognized as the only genuine method identical with the content, end quote, contrasting his own procedure with a mannerism of the day, which used an assumed set of formulas to produce in the facts a show of symmetry even more arbitrary and mechanical than the arrangements imposed ab extra in the sciences. He goes on, quote, this wilfulness we saw also take possession of the contents of philosophy and ride out an intellectual knight-errantry, for a while imposing on honest true-hearted workers, though elsewhere it only counted grotesque, and grotesque even to the pitch of madness. But oftener and more properly its teachings, far from seeming imposing or mad, were found out to be familiar trivialities, and its forms seen to be a mere trick of wit, easily acquired, methodical and premeditated, with its quaint combinations and strained eccentricities, the mean of earnestness only covering self-deception and fraud upon the public. On the other side again, we saw shallowness and unintelligence assume the character of a skepticism wise in its own eyes, and of a criticism modest in its claims for reason, enhancing their vanity and conceit in proportion as their ideas grew more vacuous. For a space of time, these two intellectual tendencies have befooled German earnestness, have tired out its profound craving for philosophy, and have been succeeded by an indifference and even a contempt for philosophical science, till at length a self-stylized modesty has the audacity to let its voice be heard in controversies touching the deepest philosophical problems, and to deny philosophy its right to that cognition by reason, the form of which was what formerly was called demonstration. The first of these phenomena may be in part explained as the youthful exuberance of the new age, which has risen in the realm of science no less than in the world of politics. If this exuberance greeted with rapture the dawn of intellectual renaissance, and without profounder labour at once set about enjoying the idea and revelling for a while in the hopes and prospects which it offered, one can more readily forgive its excesses. Because it is sound at heart, and the surface vapours which it had suffused around its solid worth must spontaneously clear off. But the other spectacle is more repulsive, because it betrays exhaustion and impotence, and tries to conceal them under a hectoring conceit which acts the censor over philosophical intellects of all the centuries, mistaking them, by most of all mistaking itself. So much the more gratifying is another spectacle yet to be noted, the interest in philosophy and the earnest love of higher knowledge, which in the presence of both tendencies has kept itself single-hearted and without affectation. Occasionally this interest may have taken too much into the language of intuition and feeling, yet its appearance proves the existence of that inward and deep-reaching impulse of reasonable intelligence which alone gives man his dignity. Proves it above all because the standpoint can only be gained as a result of philosophical consciousness, so that what it seems to disdain is at least admitted and recognized as a condition. To this interest in ascertaining the truth I dedicate this attempt to supply an introduction and contribution towards its satisfaction. End quote. The second edition appeared in 1827. Since the autumn of 1818, Hegel had been professor at Berlin, and the manuscript was sent thence from August 1826 onward to Heidelberg, where Daub, his friend, himself a master of philosophical theology, attended to the revision of the proofs. Quote, to the introduction, writes Hegel, I have given perhaps too great an amplitude, but it, above all, would have cost me time and trouble to bring within narrower compass. Tied down and distracted by lectures, and sometimes here in Berlin by other things too, I have, without a general survey, allowed myself so large a swing that the work has grown upon me, and there is a danger of it turning into a book. I have gone through it several times. The treatments of the attitudes of thought which I have distinguished in it was to meet an interest of the day. The rest I have sought to make more definite, and so far as may be, clearer. But the main fault is not mended, to do which would require me to limit the detail more, and on the other hand make the whole more surveyable, so that the contents should better answer the title of an encyclopedia. End quote. Again, in December 1826 he writes, quote, in the Naturphilosophie I have made essential changes, but could not help here and there going too far into detail, which is hardly in keeping with the tone of the whole. The second half of the Geistesphilosophy I have to modify entirely. End quote. In May 1827, Hegel offers his explanation of delay in the preface, which, like the concluding paragraphs, touches largely on contemporary theology. By August of that year, the book was finished and Hegel off to Paris for a holiday. In the second edition, which substantially fixed the form of the encyclopedia, the pages amount to 534, nearly twice as many as the first, which, however, as Professor Caird remarks, quote, has a compactness, a brief energy, and conclusiveness of expression which he never surpassed. End quote. The logic now occupies pages 1 through 214, philosophy of nature, pages 215 to 354, and philosophy of spirit from pages 355 to 534. The second part therefore has gained the least, and in the third part the chief single expansions occur towards the close and deal with the relations of philosophy, art, and religion in the state. In the first part of the logic, the main increase and alteration falls within the introductory chapters, where 96 pages take the place of 30. The Vorbegriff, preliminary notion, of the first edition had contained the distinction of 3 logical moments, with a few remarks on the methods. First, of metaphysics, and then, after a brief section on empiricism, of the, quote, critical philosophy through which philosophy has reached its close, end quote. Instead of this, the second edition deals at length under this head with the 3, quote, attitudes or positions of thought to objectivity, end quote, where, besides a more lengthy criticism of the critical philosophy, there is a discussion of the doctrines of Jacobi and the other intuitivists. The preface, like much else of the second edition, is an assertion of the right and duty of philosophy to treat independently of the things of God, and an emphatic declaration that the result of scientific investigation of the truth is, not the subversion of faith, but, quote, the restoration of that sum of absolute doctrine which thought at first would put behind and beneath itself, a restoration of it, however, in the most characteristic and freest element of the mind, end quote. Any opposition that may be raised against philosophy on religious grounds proceeds, according to Hegel, from a religion which has abandoned its true basis and entrenched itself in formulae and categories that pervert its real nature. Yet, he adds, quote, especially where religious subjects are under discussion, philosophy is expressly set aside, as if in that way all mischief were banished and security against error and illusion attained. As if philosophy, the mischief thus kept at a distance, were anything but the investigation of truth, but with a full sense of the nature and value of the intellectual links which give unity and form to all fact whatever. End quote. Lessing, he continues, quote, said in his time that people treat Spinoza like a dead dog. It cannot be said that in recent times Spinozism and speculative philosophy in general have been better treated. End quote. The time was one of feverish unrest and unwholesome irritability. Ever since the so-called Carlsbad decrees of 1819, all the agencies of higher literature and education had been subjected to an inquisitorial supervision, which everywhere surmised political insubordination and religious heresy. A petty provincialism pervaded what was then still a small residence-stadt, Berlin, and the king, Frederick William III, cherished to the full that paternal conception of his position which has not been unusual in the royal house of Prussia. Champions of orthodoxy warned him that Hegelianism was unchristian, if not even anti-Christian. Franz von Baader, the Bavarian religious philosopher, who had spent some months at Berlin during the winter of 1823 to 1824, studying the religious philosophical teaching of the universities in connection with the revolutionary doctrines which he saw fermenting throughout Europe, addressed the king in a communication which described the prevalent Protestant theology as infidel in its very source, and tending directly to annihilate the foundations of the faith. Hegel himself had to remind the censor of the heresy that, quote, all speculative philosophy on religion may be carried to atheism. All depends on who carries it. The peculiar piety of our times and the malevolence of demagogues will not let us want carriers. End quote. His own theology was suspected both by rationalists and by the evangelicals. He writes to his wife in 1827 that he had looked at university buildings in Louvain and Liège with the feeling that they might one day offer him a resting place. Quote, when the parsons in Berlin make the Kupfergraben completely intolerable for him. End quote. The Roman Curia, he adds, quote, would be a more honourable opponent than the miserable cabals of a miserable boiling of parsons in Berlin. Hence the tone which the preface proceeds. Quote, religion is the kind and mode of consciousness in which the truth appeals to all men, to men of every degree of education. But the scientific ascertainment of the truth is a special kind of this consciousness, involving a labour which not all but only a few undertake. The substance of the two is the same, but, as Homer says of some of the stars, that they have two names, and no possibility of carrying on an inquiry which would lead to knowledge and truth. Liberal theology, on its side, has not got beyond the formalism of appeals to liberty of conscience, liberty of thought, liberty of teaching, to reason itself, and to science. Such liberty, no doubt, describes the infinite right of the spirit, and the second special condition of truth, supplementary to the first, faith. But the rationalists steer clear of the material point. They do not tell us the reasonable principles and laws involved in a free and genuine conscience, nor the import and teaching of free faith and free thought. They do not get beyond a bare negative formalism, and the liberty to embody their liberty at their fancy and pleasure, whereby in the end it matters not how it is embodied. There is a further reason for their failure to reach a solid doctrine. The Christian community must be, and ought always to be, unified by the tie of a doctrinal idea, a confession of faith. But the generalities and abstractions of the stale, not living, waters of rationalism forbid the specificality of an inherently definite and fully developed body of Christian doctrine. Their opponents again, proud of the name Lord, Lord, frankly and openly disdain carrying out faith in the fullness of spirit, reality and truth." In ordinary moods of mind, there is a long way from logic to religion, but almost every page of what Hegel has called logic is witness to the belief in their ultimate identity. It was no new principle of later years for him. He had written in post-student days to his friend Schelling, quote, "Reason and freedom remain our watchword, and our point of union the invisible church." End quote. His parting token of faith with another youthful comrade, the poet Holderlin, had been, quote, "God's kingdom." End quote. But after 1827, this religious appropriation of philosophy becomes more apparent. And in 1829 Hegel seemed to deliberately accept the position of Christian philosopher which Goschel had marked out for him. Quote, "A philosophy without heart and a faith without intellect," he remarks, "are abstractions from the true life of knowledge and faith. The man whom philosophy leaves cold, and the man whom real faith does not illuminate, may be assured that the fault lies in them, not knowledge and faith. The former is still an alien to philosophy, and the latter an alien to faith." End quote. This is not the place in a philological chapter to discuss the issues involved in the announcement that the truth awaits us ready to hand, quote, "in all genuine consciousness, in all religion and philosophies." End quote. Yet one remark may be offered against the interpretations of a speculative identity. If there is a double edge to the proposition that the actual is the reasonable, there is no less caution necessary in approaching and studying from both sides the far-reaching import of that equation to which Jonas Scotus Erigena gave expression 10 centuries ago. Non alia est philosophia, i.e. sapientiae studium, et alia religio, quid e aliud de philosophia tractare nisi veri religionis regulus exponere." End quote. End of bibliographical notice on the 3 editions and 3 prefaces of the Encyclopedia. Recording by Ryan Smallwood.